Welcome everyone to another live interactive episode of I'm That Geek Show, the show that puts you face to face with world leaders, thought leaders, people that can actually help you fix your life, your relationship, your health, and your business right here in real time. I'm your host, Yifat Cohen, and if you want to join us live in real time wherever you're watching us, this is the link. I'm thatgeek.com/live. Go to this website, click the join button. You can be part of this conversation today. And what we are talking about today, we are talking about one of the major issues that is on everybody's mind in the past 6 months. COVID-19. But we're not talking about the numbers and the sick people and all the effects that it does. We're talking about solutions, specifically solutions for one of the smallest countries in the world, Israel, and how Israel has come together to find solutions for COVID-19. And to do that, we have with us the journalist, um, award-winning journalist, right? Jodie Cohen. How are you, Judy?
Very good, thank you. What an introduction. Thank you very much for having me here, Ifat.
Yeah, and Judy you are in Israel right now, right? And you are not in Israel. You were not born in Israel. So tell us a little bit just about like what drove you, like how did you find your way into Israel? And then we'll talk about the book that you wrote and all the research that goes into finding solution for COVID-19.
Right, so I was actually born in a place called Bournemouth, which is on the south coast of England, a small town, small Jewish community. I went to university in Manchester, which at the time had the highest concentration of Jewish students in Europe. So I always describe that as my first aliyah. I'd never seen so many Jews before. And then we settled in Edgware in London and absolutely loved living there, had a great life, great community, interesting work. I was involved in politics in the UK. And then we came on holiday. We had a holiday booked to Israel during, well, we didn't know there was going to be a war. It was during the Second Lebanon War. And we decided, okay, we were far enough away from the conflict that we felt it was safe, so we still came. And my husband had some meetings set up while he was there for work. And the holiday actually soon turned into, oh, we're going to be moving. He got offered a job. And so that week's holiday turned into organizing where we were going to stay, kindergartens for our kids. We then went back to London, and I remember walking into the office and meeting my colleagues, and they were really interested to hear about our experiences being in Israel during the war because we had to go into the bomb shelter at one point. So I was telling them all about it, and then following my boss into his office and saying, we've had this opportunity to go to Israel for a year for my husband's work. But I loved my work. I didn't want to give it up. And he basically said, we'll carry on working remotely, which was amazing. And we ended, that was all done in 20 days, I should add. Probably the fastest move ever. And then after the year, another one of my bosses basically said, if the clients are happy, we don't mind where you are. So just carry on working remotely. And that was now 14 years ago.
Wow, wow. So you're kind of like ahead of the game, right? Like everybody now is working remotely. You've done that 14 years ago.
Right. So people were, phoning me up and asking me, how do you stay motivated working from home? And I actually feel much more connected now, even though everybody's working in isolation. But before, clients and teams, colleagues would be perhaps together in a room, and I'd be the one dialing
Right.
in. And now everybody's on Zoom and everybody's remote, and it's great. I feel much more connected.
Finally, right? The world kind of caught up with technology and everything that's
Yes.
happening.
Yeah,
So
I
when
remember
you were
when
thinking
I
about,
first,
go ahead.
I was going to say when I first moved to Israel, I remember we didn't even have remote access to the files on the system. So people would email me things and I'd have to save everything. And I mean, that's a whole different world now with everything on
Right.
the cloud.
Totally. And so when a lot of people are thinking about Israel and they're thinking, their image is what we see in the news, where it's like fighting and rocks and mayhem, right? And people yelling at each other. There's a lot of stuff that people don't know about Israel. First of all, that you can get by without speaking Hebrew, right?
Right. So I live in a place called Renana, which is notorious for that. There's many people from different countries all over the world, many Anglo communities, and even if you go into the shops and want to practice your Hebrew, very often I might say something in Hebrew, and the people in the shop or in the cafe will want to answer in English to practice their English. So it's actually quite hard to learn Hebrew in some
It's
places.
it's really true. It's everybody, it's like the joke where Israelis know just enough to pick up on tourists, right? You, me, coffee, my house, kind of thing. That's their basic English. So you don't speak Hebrew, but you are Jewish in
Well,
England.
I do speak Hebrew now.
Now you do.
14 years.
14
Now I
years
do.
ago, right? No Hebrew. Your husband goes like, "Hey, we're moving to this new country."
Oh, no. So 14 years ago, I knew how to say, or a bit longer than 14 years ago, when I used to come on holiday, I remember going and thinking, okay, I know the words for no is lo, but I
Okay.
didn't even know the Hebrew word for yes. So I was definitely at a disadvantage then compared to now.
And that should tell you everything you need to know about the Israeli culture. The one word you need to know. No.
Lo.
And so you take your life and your children and you move to Israel and you
And
are
so
a journalist.
at the time, I had a 4-year-old daughter, a 2-year-old daughter, and I found out a couple of days before we actually made that move that I was pregnant with my son.
Perfect
So that
timing,
was a
right?
busy time.
Perfect timing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
And my
you
work originally, as I said, my work originally was in public affairs. Well, it still is actually. I do journalism. My main job, my day job, I would say, is I work in public affairs. So for 20 years, that was at a UK level, and now it's at a UN level, advising clients on how they communicate about how they're contributing to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But a lot of my work is also in the journalism sphere and still in politics, and particularly in Israel. And I commentate on Israeli politics and current affairs in the Middle East on India's World is One News.
so that opens up a whole other slew of questions that I have for you, but we're going to table that for
Sure.
another Israeli conversation. So then you find yourself 6 months ago in one of the biggest plagues of the world, right? The biggest disease. And what made you think about writing a book and finding out all the innovations that are happening around that topic?
So I had already, my work, I have like a quarter in the year where work is quieter. So I had already had in mind that I was going to write a book about Israel and all the amazing things that Israel's doing in the areas of sustainability. And so I actually had started that. I started writing this book, and
Judy, I
then
need you to bring the
coronavirus happened.
microphone a little bit more.
Sure, is that
There
better?
we
Can
go.
you hear now?
Yes.
So I was starting to write this book about Israel and sustainability, and a lot of what I do is also some of the clients that I work with are in the pharmaceutical and healthcare and medical device sector. Um, so this is like an area I'm familiar with. So I'd started to write this other book, and then the coronavirus started, and I realized that the projects that I was writing about, so for example, how Israel is working in partnership with thousands of farmers in India, helping them with drip irrigation and sustainable agriculture. I didn't know if those projects were going to carry on because of coronavirus. We were seeing images on the TV news of people coming back to Israel, people who, some of whom had been living away from Israel for years, but just felt with coronavirus and the uncertainty and the skies and the borders closing that they should come and be near their families because who knew what was going to happen. So I sort of thought, well, I can't do that for now. But then I had my son's bar mitzvah and the lockdown started. and things were
Always good
getting
timing for
tighter.
you, right? It's always good timing.
The best, the best. So I had all these plans. I had been planning for a year what we were going to do. I mean, the truth is, I've been planning for 13 years. You know, we were going to have my son's bar mitzvah at the Kotel, the Western Wall in Jerusalem, and I had it all planned out. And then it was getting narrower and narrower and narrower as the weeks were going by. And my husband just said to me, just stop planning. We don't know what's going to be. And he was like, 3 days before, then we'll decide. And of course, at that point, the lockdown, this was the first lockdown now in Israel, was at its absolute height. So we were literally the 5 of us in our home. We did something on Zoom. So we felt connected to our family and friends abroad, but we couldn't invite anybody over. It was completely unlike anything we had ever anticipated. And once the bar mitzvah was over and I had more time to think, every day on the news I was seeing incredible stories of innovations that were coming out of Israel and new things that were being tested, or technologies that people had that they were then pivoting towards, trying to tackle some aspects of the coronavirus. And I thought, wow, this is really incredible. I mean, Israel is a tiny country. It's the size of New Jersey. It's the size of Wales in the United Kingdom. It's a really small country, even though we always hear a lot about it on the news. And yet every day I was hearing more and more stories about things that were being developed here. And I just thought, that's incredible, and what an amazing story. So I started to look into that. And then I also felt that if such a small place, obviously it's big in stature but small geographically, if such a small place can be producing so much, then it's a really positive indication for the world, for things in the pipeline and innovations and technologies that are being tested and research that's being investigated. And obviously, these things take time, right. But I just thought that was a real message of optimism. And the book is, in the future, I always say that people will look back on it as a history book. What were the scientists and the doctors and the CEOs and the NGOs, what were they busy doing during the 2 months of the first lockdown in Israel? And so the book highlights about 30 innovations, covering the areas of looking at healthcare areas specifically. So it's looking at helping to prevent the spread of the virus, testing, patient care, and the search for treatments and vaccines. And another real motivation for me was my best friend from Bournemouth, who I'm still in touch with. She runs a nursing home. And she was speaking to her on the phone to see how the residents doing in the UK and coronavirus, and we were exchanging stories, and I was telling her about these innovations that I was reading about, and saying, well, and putting her in touch with institutions in Israel to see if she could perhaps get hold of these mosques or whatever they were for her residents. And that made me think, these are valuable. I don't want to keep using the word stories, because these are valuable healthcare innovations that people need to hear about in the world. But I would say one caveat, and this is really important, and through the whole publishing process, this became really evident as well, that this is not a book for people who are looking, if they unfortunately have the coronavirus or if their friends and family members have it. This is not a book in any way that suggests, do this and you'll get better. Not at all. This is almost, as I said, like the word history book. This is a snapshot of history of the innovations that were developed in that 2-month period during lockdown in Israel, which, offers hope and hopefully good signs for the future, that potentially solutions might be developed here. And that's one more point that I think is important to say as well, is that, and I point this out in the book, that some of the innovations might well go on to be proven to be effective and do incredible things. Some of them may well have had that potential, but maybe they won't get the funding, and others will be proven not to be effective. This is, really, it's an illustration of the breadth and depth of what's going on in this tiny country.
And it's really interesting, right? Because we were going that way. We were going towards online, we were going towards innovation, but it seems like COVID just accelerated the rate of innovation. Israelis are always doing stuff, right? But then they took some of the existing technologies that they already had and they modified them. And you feature a few of those in your book. So can you touch on a few of those that were existing before, but kind of like under the radar, and then COVID happened and they became this amazing tool that really saved lives, right?
Right, so the one that immediately springs to mind is a company called Visible Zone. And they had this technology, and it was designed to help pedestrians sort of communicate through mobile phones with cars, and for cars also to sense where pedestrians are in the street. And the aim was to save lives, because unfortunately a number of people in Israel get run over every year. A number will die from car accidents. So that was the original technology. And then when coronavirus appeared, they realized that their technology enables sort of more detailed contact tracing. So for example, if you own a factory and somebody in your factory, one of the workers, has coronavirus, then perhaps the whole factory floor has to go into quarantine. Well, with this technology, the idea is that they can pinpoint more specifically who has been close to that person, so that the entire factory floor doesn't have to shut down and production can continue. Obviously, right now we have our second lockdown in Israel, so people I don't think, are working in factories so much at the moment. But so it's really incredible how people took their existing. I mean, for example, if you look at vaccines, the Miguel Galilee Research Institute, they had a coronavirus vaccine that was approved for poultry, for coronavirus in poultry. And when the coronavirus appeared, they realized that the genetic sequence of the poultry coronavirus is almost identical to the human coronavirus. So now they're busy going through the stages of the testing on their potential human coronavirus vaccine. And what's particularly good about that potential vaccine, if it's successful, is it is administered through oral drops, which has huge implications in terms of not needing, the little vials and the glass containers and the needles, and to train people to give injections across the world, particularly more in developing countries. So we'll see what happens with that. Hopefully, good news from that.
Yeah. And so Israel was one of the first countries to shut down, right? And then they kind of like contained the virus, and then they opened up, right? There were a lot of cries to open up quickly because of the economy. And then the wave of sick people came back out, rose again, and now we're in another shutdown in Israel. So can you talk a little bit about this cycle and what's going on there right now?
Right, so we had this very tight 2-month lockdown in the first lockdown, and the numbers got down to 12 new cases a day, which was incredible. But there's the constant demand on not just the Israeli government, on all governments across the world, the constant balance of weighing up, on the one hand, this medical emergency that we're dealing with, and on the other hand, needing to save the economy. And in that respect as well, save lives, because if you don't have people working and people aren't paying taxes, then who's funding the hospitals? And so this, plus the whole health issue of people wanting to get back to normal and wanting to see their families and friends and get out. And I don't think they'll be getting back to normal for a while,
until the holidays, no? At the end of the holidays.
Which holidays?
No,
next summer holidays. No. So tonight, the Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, reportedly, he was talking to the coronavirus cabinet, and he talked about how he doesn't think the second lockdown will be eased after the Jewish festivals now that's coming up this next week.
Hopefully before November, because we're landing November 1st. So come on, Israel.
Oh, well, he was talking about some sort of lockdown, hopefully not the tight lockdown we're experiencing now, but for the next potentially 6 months to even a year. So somewhat depressing news with that. But the commentators obviously were talking about, speculating about, what does this mean? Does this mean that schools will be shut, potentially for the next year, that all the children will be learning online from home? But obviously that has implications then for work. But right now, I mean, in the first lockdown, at the height of the lockdowns, you weren't allowed beyond 100 meters from your home unless you had to go to the pharmacy or a supermarket, or for a hospital, a medical appointment, something like that. Right now, we don't have that limitation. We're allowed to go up to 1 kilometer from our home. You are allowed to go beyond that to exercise. The new rules, again, from today, is you're not allowed to go beyond 1 kilometer from your home to protest. So people are organizing protests. So they're not saying that you can't protest and that you can't gather for
Just in your
protest,
own
but they're
balcony.
applying they're applying similar rules to prayer as they are to protest, because there are lots of calls in society, even from secular people who don't necessarily feel the need to go out and pray themselves, but acknowledged that there was an influence in the rules, because still thousands of people protesting in Jerusalem outside the Prime Minister's residence, versus the restrictions on going to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year.
So,
So,
this is very interesting because on one hand, we are talking about an innovative country, right? That's very high tech, very science invested, very out there on the cutting edge of health and technology and agriculture and water preservation. And the flip side of it is the demonstrations, right? Where it's like, okay, we're just gonna go in masses and protest on the streets, and it's kind of like almost looks like a little bit of a contrary behavior, right? Because if we have a lot of people who are, go ahead, yeah.
I would disagree. I would actually say that that is part of the strength of Israel, that people care so passionately about the country, and people are willing to cross the country and take time away from, if they're working and their family, their friends, to go to a protest, shows how much democracy is valued in this country. And I think that goes hand in hand with this passion for innovation and passion for the startup culture here. There's also a passion for democracy. There's a passion for tradition as well. Everything is passionate in Israel. Yes.
That is one great way to describe Israel. It's very passionate. I remember
Yes.
when my cousin went to Israel, and she's a New Yorker, and she came, she visits Israel every summer, and then she goes to Morocco, and she sits on the bus, and this guy in Morocco is like right here, right, blah 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 blah, blah. And she gets scared a little bit because she's like, I don't know this guy. And then,
Mhm.
her uncles, her Israeli uncles, are flashing through her mind. She goes like, "That's my uncle, my Israeli uncle. We're talking right here, right? There's no space or
No personalities.
right there. Very passionate, very like,
Yeah.
so that is
Well,
so
when everyone feels like, it sounds like a cliche, but people do feel like this is one big family here.
right.
And they're very much in your business. If I remember a story about a friend who had a baby, and she was walking, it was her first baby, and she was walking down the street, and somebody stopped and said, "No, what are you doing? The baby's too hot. You've got to take the layers off." So she said, "Oh, thank you, thank you." Walked down the street, and somebody else said to her, "What are you doing? The baby's too cold. You've got to wrap her up. You've got to swaddle her." So people definitely feel like we're a family, we're connected, and I think that also goes hand in hand with the protests, because if you see, and also why people are critical of other members of even different community, like sects within the community, um, because when you see a family member doing what you think is wrong, you want to say something, you want to fix things and make things better.
That is so true. Um, so we
Mhm.
talked about kind of like, the book and some of the innovations that are happening right now, and a little bit about the culture and, the Israelis. And I invite everybody, if you are even thinking of going to Israel, don't believe the media so much. Wait until
Mm.
COVID passes and come to this country because it's beautiful. Very passionate, great food, great people, wonderful scenery, and a lot of innovation, and you'll hear everybody's opinions about everything, even if you don't want to.
Mhm.
So we're talking about, patient care, right, and actually dealing with COVID What potential treatments are being worked on right now in Israel?
Oh, this is the one I love the most. When you talk about vaccines, I think um, I'll go back to treatments in a second. When you talk about vaccines, you could say that perhaps Israel is a step back, particularly from the United States. There's also great work being done there, and we'll come to that. But with treatments, I think there's some really exciting innovations on the horizon. So one example is a company called Pluristem, and they take cells. And I actually went to visit them in Haifa recently. And it was amazing walking around their lab, and you see how they have a collaboration with a nearby hospital. So when women give birth, they can choose to donate their placenta.
Oh,
And one placenta can potentially help 20,000 patients. And I saw all the machinery of how they take cells and they clean them and process. I can't even describe to you what they do. It's like they showed me machines which they said replicates the human body and how it looks after the placenta. It was incredible. And they already use these cells to treat people with serious illnesses. And when coronavirus came, they thought, well, perhaps this will help patients who are suffering from complications like with the lungs from coronavirus. And they got permission to use this treatment in compassionate use programs in the United States and in Israel. So compassionate use programs are when the doctor says, unfortunately, this patient is at death's door and there's nothing more that we can do for them, then the families can basically say, okay, we will allow you, give permission to try this experiential treatment. And so they did this to a number of patients. And after 28 days, they did a follow-up study, which showed that 87% of the patients who'd been given the placenta cell therapy were still alive, which is incredible considering they were basically on death's door. And I don't know if you've read about it in the press, but one of the Wicked set designers was the very first patient in the United States to receive this therapy, and thank goodness he's now recovered. So Pluristem, I think, has great potential. They're now doing trials as well as in the United States and in Israel. They're also doing trials in Germany.
Wow.
So I'm looking forward to hearing more from them. There's a company called Kamada as well. Now, Kamada take antibodies from people who have recovered from the coronavirus, and they use them to treat people suffering from the coronavirus. They believe that they're the first company in the world to manufacture this antibody treatment for the coronavirus. And they also believe that they're the first company to have started clinical trials on this potential treatment. And again, they've just announced interim results of their study, which show that after this is not on patients with severe cases. This is on sort of serious cases, but not people on death's door. And after 4.5 days, 90% of the people who'd received this treatment were discharged from hospital.
Wow.
So these are people who had serious breathing issues as a result of complications caused by the COVID-19. And 5 days later, walking out of hospital. It's just amazing.
Yeah. So how long ago was that? I mean, did they follow up and they know like they're not breathing fine?
Those interim results, I think, were just announced a couple of weeks ago, and I think they said by January that they'll be announcing their final results of that trial. So
because here, people are coming out with stories of like if you were sick and you recovered, there after effects where you still have trouble breathing and you're still not very well and you have all these kind of issues. And I'm really wondering if they're being treated with that treatment and they're going out after 4 or 5 days, do they have any of the symptoms that people here exhibit of recovering of their own?
So I'm sure they'll be doing that as part of their follow-up. That's a really good question. And we are hearing stories. I have a friend who had coronavirus and was in hospital, and then when one of the do you have coronavirus hotels in the United States?
No.
Okay, so this This is another innovation. I love it. I think I
Yeah,
have heard of them since in Australia,
yeah,
but and it makes so much sense. You've got all these hotels in Israel who are normally bustling with tourists and groups that come from all over to visit Jerusalem, and then you've got people who might live in crowded apartments who can't stay away from their family members. So the government or the hotel industry, I don't know who they got together and decided, let's open Corona hotels. So they have Corona hotels across the country. They have Corona hotels for people who need to be in quarantine but just can't isolate from their families at home. And then they have Corona hotels for people who actually have the coronavirus but who aren't serious enough to be in hospital. And it's actually a chance. I have stories that, from a friend who was in the Corona hotel who was saying that people were socializing because while the rest of the country was in lockdown, the people in the Corona hotel actually could
party.
socialize and get together, have a party. Yeah. But yes, there are definitely cases of people having longer term side effects of the coronavirus, even after they're not contagious anymore and they can't pass it on to other people, but that they feel very exhausted. I mean, my daughter, actually, my almost 19-year-old, she has coronavirus. I would say a relatively mild case. She didn't need to go into hospital or anything like that. She felt very, very unwell, had a high temperature and a headache for a couple of days. And then the most tiny cough, as in, that was it. That was it. She thought she was completely better. And it turns out that then she found out she'd been exposed to somebody with coronavirus. So she went for a test. We all went for a test, and she had it, and then the rest of us
So,
were
so
actually
being,
okay.
so much into, the innovation and the health, and researching all that, what do you think is, how true do you think the claim is that it's just another version of the flu and we're just making a big deal out of it because like people get the flu and they get over it, some people get over it, some people don't. Um, do you think there's anything to compare? Like in your daughter goes like, and that's it, right? It's not a bigger thing. And some people really, we had a guy, a member of our family, 32 years old, I believe, in Florida, who died from it, right? So it's not like
Wow,
just,
wow.
yeah, not just
Yeah,
like
no,
old people. Yeah.
yeah, no. My very good friend in London, unfortunately, her father also passed away from it, and he had no pre-existing conditions, and he wasn't especially old. Um, and you do hear about, no, it's rare, but you hear about 19-year-olds dying from it. I remember the first time I heard that there were people out there denying this and just thinking, how can that be? I mean, you can, all you have to do is go for yourself into a hospital. So I was actually in hospital myself a month ago. I'm fine now and it wasn't corona. And I was in the hospital, and about 8 times within the space of a couple of hours, they shouted out corona, and the people in the hazmats came through, and they took people through who were corona patients, and they had to keep everybody else away. I mean, you just have to go into the hospitals and see how overworked they are. That this isn't just a flu. And if you unfortunately look at the figures of people dying, I just don't understand how people can dismiss it. That I understand that people need to make a living. Absolutely understand, and that it's very, very hard to to be told to go into a lockdown and your business can suffer, and you feel like, well, why can't I? I don't see customers, and my business could stay running. And I understand that it's really, really hard, but at the end of the day, we all just need to get through this together. And governments and health organizations across the world have been grappling to, first of all, identify, if you talk about it in war terms, identify what the enemy, who the enemy is, and the characteristics of the enemy and what we're facing here. They've started to get a better understanding of it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
then,
we have oops, there we go. We have a comment from Twitter. BT says that it's a very bad virus. Take no chances. Yeah, protect yourself. Stay safe. Stay safe wherever you are. We're talking about Israel and Israel versus COVID. It's a book that Judy wrote. It's called Tikkun Olam. And you can find a link to the book right here on imthatgeek.com/live. Right next to the video, there's this image. Click on it, and you can get access to the book and learn more about that and the stories around it. And we're talking about how a very, very small country, Israel, is managing to create these types of innovations and procedures that really save lives. If you want to be part of the conversation, hop on here, thatgeek.com/live, click the button below the video and come in and let's have a conversation about everything that's happening right now in Israel, in the world around COVID. So we were talking, Judy, about how small Israel really is, right? And all the innovations and technological advantages that are happening in this country. What do you think? What do you think is it in Israel that fosters this type of culture that creates these type of innovations very, very quickly?
That's a great question. Jonathan Medved, who runs Our Crowds, which is an investment firm in Israel, across the world, I believe, he always describes how Israelis turn curses into blessings. Mm-hmm. So as you said, it's a small geographic country, only a population of not even 9 million people, very few natural resources. This is a country where only 2% of the land is a water resource, and yet we've turned that curse into a blessing, and now Israel is a water exporter and it's a global leader in water recycling. So we take our challenges and sort of pivot them we address them, see how we can fix this, and then advance from there. Yoel Ha'even, who is the international director at Sheba Medical Center, a leading hospital in Israel, he talks about credits Israeli society with just being used to emergency scenarios. Like if you go into any school or even kindergarten across Israel, a couple of times a year, they'll do these emergency scenarios that people are used to, suddenly having to drop everything because unfortunately there's a rocket attack or something's happened, there's been a disaster. And they're used to planning for that across the entire country, across the entire scenario, and that has been helpful. In the past, it might have been that you plan your day and then a rocket will be fired from Gaza and the siren will go off unexpectedly, and so you have to drop everything. And on a larger scale, I think Israel's response has been like that suddenly we're all faced, it's the first time in the whole world has been grappling with the same challenge everywhere at the same time. It's right. It's enormous if you think about it, how it's changed all of our lives. Right. And so Israeli society is used to, okay, there's this crisis, drop everything, pivot, we're going to turn, we're going to deal with it. I always talk about how, about 10 years ago, Israel became known as the startup nation. It became known for these amazing technologies and innovations. And over the past 10 years, as I've been working more on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Israel's involvement with that, I've really seen how these technologies have sort of turned towards trying to tackle some of the biggest challenges facing the world today. And I see this as sort of a continuum from that, okay, now the biggest challenge is coronavirus. So again, from my discussions with the CEOs and the researchers and scientists and doctors, everybody sees it as their personal mission. Like, what can I do to help? Everyone has family members phoning from, sometimes across the world. So proud of you, what you're doing. You're working so hard. How's it going? What solutions are you coming up with? And the President Rivlin talked about how, at one stage, all eyes were on Israel with the Israeli Institute of Biological Research and their progress and looking at how we can use antibodies potentially in treatments and vaccines, and all eyes are on Israel. There was a great expectation here that Israel would innovate and that potential solutions will come from this tiny place.
Do you feel it's kind of like a race to the cure? Like all countries are trying to be like the first one that will come up with the cure and
Absolutely. I mean, there are huge, I'm sure there are huge financial stakes. I actually work with a global pharmaceutical company who are involved in this race, as you say, for a vaccine, and they've committed to not profiting from any vaccine that they develop during the coronavirus. And there's a lot of cooperation going on across the world with the WHO raising funds for vaccines, for billions of people across the world. I called the final chapter in the book, actually, I've called it chapter 5. I called it the race for vaccines. But it's not a winner takes all race. It's not that the first one who crosses the finishing line will be the winner and get all the prizes. The world is going to need several vaccines. The world is a big place. There's lots of people, and it's going to unfortunately take time to get vaccines, even when they are discovered and proven to be effective, and they passed all the clinical trials. It's going to take time to get vaccines to everybody, and there'll be some vaccines that won't work with particular populations or people with potentially pre-existing conditions. So we're going to need, as I said, global cooperation. I think partnerships are absolutely crucial. One example of partnerships that I will call out is again Sheba. Sheba, they're in Tel Aviv. They have something like 200 projects going on covering all aspects of coronavirus, and they're working with leading hospitals all over the world on developing these potential treatments and vaccines and testing and looking at all different aspects. And I mean, they've done some remarkable things. Within 72 hours, they converted the underground car park of the hospital, and they turned it into a coronavirus ward, because they realized if they were going to have coronavirus patients coming in, they needed to keep them separate from the rest of the hospital, and also to be able to keep the rest of the hospital running. So they turned their underground car park into this coronavirus ward in a matter of days. They were the first ones to take the first Israeli passengers who were on the Diamond Princess cruise ship. Remember back in, it must have been March, those passengers who were on a cruise and they were stuck for a long time on the cruise ship because the coronavirus was spreading, and took the first Israelis off that cruise ship. They helped them with the technology that's being developed in Israel, like PhytoCare, like Temi robots. They use those, so caring for patients at a distance to protect the medical staff and prevent the further spread of the virus, while still helping the patients, using robots in hospitals to take things into the patients, just keeping that distance. So they've done amazing things. They were the first ones in the world to open a maternity ward for corona patients. They were the first in the world to open a psychiatric ward for corona patients.
wow.
And then today I've just heard the news that they've opened a children ward, and complete with medical clowns and hazmat suits and everything, to keep children who are contracted with coronavirus, who do need to go into hospital, to keep them away from the other children, and also enable them to be with their families who may or may not have coronavirus. So they're given the choice about if they want to stay with their kids in the hospital.
So, you're talking about time, right? It's going to take time. It's going to take time to find the cure, to test the cure, to make sure that it works. And this is a global thing, not just a local thing. So getting everybody vaccinated, we're looking at like what, 12, 18 months before life goes back to normal. And a lot of people are saying there's no more normal, right? Like every day it's a new thing. Every day something new happens. So how does Israel prepare itself for that, right? It's a completely new way of living. We are such a close society. Everybody is always with their families and their friends and hugging and kissing and being like all together. And all of a sudden, everybody has to be in their house and not close to each other and kind of like separate, and no end in sight, right? So are you optimistic about like where Israel is going, where the world is going, by the time it takes us to actually figure out what we're doing and what the new normal is?
Mm. So I am optimistic. I mean, the first thing I would say is that normally, on average, it might take 5 years to develop a vaccine, but the regulatory authorities around the world are really, speeding things up as far as they can in a safe way to speed up the whole testing process. I mean, you've got companies like there's an Israeli company here that I talk about in the book called Cytoreason, and they have this technology where pharmaceutical companies can test their potential treatments for anything on their platform, and they can see down to the molecular level how that treatment will impact patients and patients with varying conditions. They can really test it.
Wow.
So when they heard about the coronavirus, they got data from all over the world. They had literally data from all countries on coronavirus. And now they've opened up their platform to all pharmaceutical customers who are working on developing a potential treatment for coronavirus free of charge. So when you hear things like that, I think it's very hard not to be optimistic. So you're looking at a potential time frame for a vaccine going from 5 years down to, in a best case scenario, they say a year and a half. I mean, I know President Trump would love to be able to announce something before the elections. Who knows if that will happen or not? But yeah, I mean, good if that happens, and if it's safe, amazing. We've heard about the potential vaccine in Russia. If they work, if they say fantastic. We'll have to trust the authorities to let us know if they're safe. But please God, we will
that's a
get
really important word you just used. You said trust, right? What is the trust? Like, there's a lot of protests in Israel that are happening. There's a lot of protests here that are happening all over the world, right? In Europe, people are protesting. If we're talking about trust, especially trust in governments and trust that the government has the best interest of the people in mind, um, especially when it comes to something that you inject into your body. Where does that stand in general? Where is the level of the world trust in a cure, in a vaccine, in the care of their own governments?
That's a really interesting point. I think it bottles down to the fact that we all have personal responsibility. We have personal responsibility for ourselves. We can decide whether or not we will take that vaccine if we trust in the process enough. And yet we have this communal responsibility where we need to do everything we can on a personal basis, because everything we do will have an impact on other people. After the first lockdown was eased, I would go out into the streets and get so upset because I would see people not wearing masks.
Right.
And I know mask wearing and the right not to have that enforced upon you is another political issue, and it all bottles down to this issue of trust and personal rights versus communal responsibility.
Right.
And there are things that governments can do to encourage people to abide by the rules. So once the government posed a fine, some people started to wear masks. When they doubled the fine, there was a lot more people wearing a mask on the street. And now they're, again, in the news today, they were talking about really ramping up the fines for people breaking quarantine rules, for people not wearing masks out in public, for people gathering together in parties, or for businesses opening up illegally. And we're talking even for schools opening illegally. They were talking about a potential fine of up to 50,000 shekels, which is, well, I'm not sure what that is in dollars, but
50 shekels,
1,000 pounds.
50 shekels?
50,000 shekels.
Oh, that's like $10,000-$15,000.
Yeah. So for a school, that would be significant.
Yeah.
So, with every situation, every government has those tools to enforce, but also to encourage and incentivize people to stick to those rules for the good of everyone. But at the end of the day, it is down to personal responsibility as well as individual rights.
And so your book was published in May, right? It kind of
in
covered
June.
in June. So it
Yeah,
covered everything that happened before June. We are 3 months out. Do you keep track? Like, do you have a blog or a website where you update things that are happening after the book's release?
I I do. If people go to tikkunolam.israel.com, I write blogs there. I any sort of media coverage or interviews like this one, I upload to there. I also write a blog on the Times of Israel website, where I talk about developments in innovations in Israel, and particularly innovations that are featured in the book, so I can keep people up to date with any new developments.
And so let's finish with Tikkun Olam. That is a Hebrew
Mm.
word that means fixing the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tikkun Olam. So why did you name your book Tikkun Olam?
So, Tikkun Olam, as you said, it means fixing, repairing the world, and it's a really important Jewish concept. It's one that even non-religious, non-observant Jews can identify with. It's the idea of, as I said, from those discussions I had with the scientists and everybody, it's really the impression I got from the people I spoke to when researching the book. The idea of what can I personally do to try and help, and it also reflects how I chose the innovations that are featured in the book. So I didn't just take innovations that maybe got some media coverage and were doing quite well, and people were hearing about it within Israel. I took those innovations that were already, even by April, so a few weeks, a month into the coronavirus lockdown being, and the coronavirus, in fact, actually being in Israel, the ones that were already working in partnership with other countries. So perhaps they were, testing it in hospitals and testing their innovations or potential treatments in hospitals in other countries. So it was really the idea of it's the ones that were not just helping people within Israel, but were already spreading out and working in partnership, which is so important when we think of the big challenges facing the world today, but especially the coronavirus. Working internationally, globally with other countries, that sharing of knowledge is going to be so crucial to fixing this virus.
Yeah, and I think, the virus kind of like put us in a very interesting place, right? We were competing and fighting and wars and or, silly stuff. And all of a sudden we're all in this situation where we all have to figure it out. And it's beautiful to see all the collaborations, all the mutual help that is going back and forth just for the sake of helping, right? Just for the sake of
Mm,
saving lives. Like you mentioned, there's
right.
companies that they're developing a cure and they're not going to take any profits just to help the world. So we haven't seen
And
that on
also,
that level, right?
yeah, and if you even look at the signing of the Abraham Accords between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and obviously there's this now peace agreement with Bahrain as well.
Yeah.
But particularly, they've already signed this peace treaty between Israel and the UAE, and how many weeks are we since that? Maybe 2 weeks since that, and Sheba Hospital has already announced a partnership with an institution in the UAE, and Pluristem have already announced a partnership with a similar cell therapy company in the UAE. So already we're seeing the fruits of these collaborations and the fruits of this peace announcement, hopefully for the benefit not just of our two countries, but of the region and ultimately the world.
Yes, and you're mentioning different type of collaborations in your book. So I will recommend again, guys, if you're interested in reading about what's happening in that little piece of the world, then go to amthatgeek.com/live. Right next to the video, you will see Judy's book. Looks like that. Click on that, and you can get access. You find out exactly how you can get your hands on the book. It's a very easy and very interesting read, so I highly recommend that you dive into that. If you want to take your mind off of all the troubles that are happening and kind of like focus a little bit on the good that's happening, on the solutions, on the collaborations, and the advances that are taking place all over the world, starting in Israel and spreading out, I highly recommend grab this right to the right of the video. So Judy, this is super exciting. I'm like you, I'm very optimistic about where we're going. I think it's kind of like growing pains right now. but we are definitely going at it as a collective, as an international collective, and not just one country that's suffering from fires or floods or hurricanes or something like that. So it's a fantastic way to see the world come together and do something as humanity, right? Like as humans, and not just as us and them and Americans and stuff. So, so thank you so much, A, for writing the book, willing to come on the show and share it with everybody.
Pleasure.
And
Thank you for having me.
of course, it's like, what time is it over there? Midnight?
It's no 10 o'clock.
10 o'clock. So
Not
you're
too
good.
bad.
So thanks again.
Got my pajamas right there.
That's right. Yeah. Um, thank you again. And guys, in 2 weeks, we are going to dive into webinars, really a complete 180 degrees. So webinars, technology, are they still working in 2020? Should you pay attention to them? If so, how should you approach webinars? Right here on imthatgeek.com/live, Thursday, 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll see you there. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.